I don't know if anyone else remembers fear the way children do, how it presses into your ribs and curls up inside your stomach like something alive. But I do, especially that one summer night when the sky cracked open and the house felt smaller than it had ever been, as if the walls were struggling to hold back whatever storm had decided to lean on the roof. I was 10 years old then, still small enough to believe that grown-ups had some kind of power over the weather, still naive enough to think comfort could be summoned just by calling someone's name in the dark. I hadn't expected him to come in. Not then. Not ever, really. But he did, quietly, without knocking. Just opened the door with the same steady hand he used for everything else, looked at me for a moment like he wasn't sure if he should speak, then crossed the room and lowered himself onto the edge of the bed without a word, like someone laying down a heavy coat beside a fire. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't promise that the storm would pass, didn't do any of the things I thought people were supposed to do in those moments. He just lay down beside me, breathing slow and deep, anchoring the room. At the time, I remember thinking it felt like safety, like nothing could reach me as long as he was there, like maybe the world would hold itself together if we both stayed still enough. But now, years later, when that memory floats back into my mind, always when I'm least expecting it, I can't help but feel the warmth of that moment a little differently. Not darker, not wrong exactly, but closer to something I don't quite know how to name. Something too old for a child and too sharp for a dream. Now I'm 24, older in ways that have nothing to do with years. And after fracturing my leg during what I still tell people was a bad fall, though it was really just me misjudging a step in a parking lot and trying to pretend I wasn't in pain until the swelling forced the truth out, I ended up back here, in the house I'd left behind almost 6 years ago. In the room that doesn't smell like me anymore and hasn't for a long time. Mom offered to help while I recovered, said I could stay as long as I needed. And because I had nowhere else to go, not really, I said yes without thinking. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't have planned for, was how often she's gone now, how the night shifts at the hospital stretch until dawn, how I end up alone downstairs while he moves through the kitchen like nothing's different. Like I'm not there with my crutches and my stubborn silence, pretending I don't notice the way we keep orbiting the same rooms without saying much at all, without holding eye contact too long, without breaking whatever quiet rhythm we've fallen into like it's some unspoken agreement. He's not cruel. Never was. But he's careful. The kind of careful that makes you feel like every movement has already been weighed and measured, like he's still trying to be just present enough. And that balance is more unnerving than anything else, because it means he sees me, really sees me, and still chooses to remain behind that invisible line we both pretend doesn't exist, even when we're standing just feet apart in a hallway that suddenly feels too narrow. Tonight, though, the weather's shifted again, and from the first rumble of thunder low in the distance, I could feel something in my chest tighten. Like my body remembered something my brain hadn't quite caught up to yet. Like there was some part of me that had never unlearned what it meant to brace for a storm, what it meant to wait for footsteps in the hall. The lights flickered during dinner, then held steady, but by the time I was settled on the couch, leg propped up and blanket pulled around me, I could see the trees bending against the night through the kitchen window. I tried to focus on the show playing in front of me, let the canned laughter and predictable dialogue fill the space where my thoughts were starting to circle. But then the room went dark. Completely. Suddenly, without warning. And the silence that followed was heavier than it should have been, like even the house was listening. I sat frozen for a second, letting my eyes adjust, listening to my own heartbeat, counting the seconds since the power went out. I called his name. Not loud, just enough to break the air. And a few seconds later, I heard footsteps from the hallway, steady and slow, and then the beam of a flashlight caught the edge of the ceiling before sweeping across the floor. He stepped into the room, flashlight held low, and for a moment we just looked at each other, both quiet, both still, until he asked if I was all right, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust myself to say anything that wouldn't sound like more than it was. He moved into the kitchen, rummaged through the drawers, still the third one to the left of the sink, still filled with those mismatched lighters and old takeout menus, found the candles, lit one, and set it on the counter, and I watched him from where I sat, unable to stop myself from following the outline of his movements like they might explain something I didn't understand. Like the answer to a question I hadn't asked was hiding in the way he struck the match. Eventually, he brought over a cup of tea, set it beside me, said it was chamomile. Still your favorite, right? And I managed to thank you, though my hands trembled more than they should as I took the mug, though the heat from the cup did nothing to calm whatever had started to flicker beneath my ribs. We sat in silence after that. Him in the armchair, me wrapped in the same blanket I'd slept with as a kid, the candle throwing wind-blown shadows on the ceiling, shadows that seemed to breathe with the air. And maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the flicker of memory. Maybe it was just the weight of being seen by someone who remembers who you were before you learned how to pretend. But I found myself asking if he remembered that night. The one when I was 10. The one with thunder that could split the world. The one where he lay down beside me and didn't speak. He didn't look at me, just nodded. Said yeah. Said he thought I needed someone there to help me stay calm. Said it seemed like the right thing at the time. I didn't know what I expected him to say. Didn't know why I asked at all. But as we sat there with the candle between us and the wind rattling the windows, I couldn't help but think, what if that moment was never as simple as I thought it was? What if I've been carrying something with me all these years that I never wanted to name out loud? Something I've tiptoed around in my mind for years? Something that's been hiding in the quiet, waiting for a storm like this to wake it up again? The room was quiet, but not peaceful. Not really. And somewhere beneath my ribs, I felt it move again. That old memory, breathing in the dark. The silence after a blackout isn't real silence. Not when the house keeps creaking like it's remembering how old it is. Not when the rain beats steady against the windows like small fists. Not when every breath you pull in sounds so loud it feels like it could crack the air wide open. And sitting there on the couch with my leg aching under the weight of 2 blankets, I realized how much noise we normally drown in without noticing until it all disappears at once. There was no heater kicking on, no hum from the fridge, no internet router blinking in the corner, which weirdly made me more nervous than the dark itself. No distant neighbors' TVs leaking through thin walls, just the candle on the coffee table spitting tiny hisses every time the draft caught it, and the long, slow drip of water off the gutters outside. I sat there for a few minutes, longer maybe, trying to tell myself the darkness was temporary, trying not to feel every beat of my heart in my throat, when I heard his footsteps again, the slow scrape of rubber soles against wood, and then the faint arc of flashlight glow catching the ceiling before it slid down the far wall. He didn't say anything at first, just came over, reached out a hand, palm up, fingers loose like he was offering me a choice. And without even thinking, I grabbed on, my fingers curling into his like they remembered the shape of him before my mind caught up, and the heat from his skin buzzed up my arm and made it harder to breathe. He helped me up carefully, one hand on my elbow, the other steadying the crutch under my opposite arm, moving like someone who already knew exactly where all my weak spots were. He probably did. And we started toward the kitchen, slow, awkward steps that sounded too loud in the open space. The flashlight bobbed ahead of us in jerky little arcs, painting long, quick shadows across the walls. And I realized we were breathing almost in sync, his breaths slow and deep, mine faster and shallow enough to make my head light. And when his arm brushed mine accidentally, or maybe not, I stiffened so hard he glanced at me, worried, but I just shook my head and kept going. In the kitchen, he let go of me long enough to grab a glass from the cabinet, still the second shelf, even after all these years, and filled it from the water jug we always kept on the counter because the tap water here tasted like metal. When he handed me the glass, his fingers grazed mine again, lighter this time, almost like a question. And the heat that shot through me had nothing to do with the warm, stuffy air trapped in the house after hours without circulation. I took a slow sip to buy myself a second, stared at the candle flame bending toward the window like it wanted to escape. And when he asked quietly if I needed anything else, I shook my head, my voice still jammed somewhere tight between my ribs and my throat. There was a long moment where we just stood there, only a few feet apart, the dark pressing in like a hand on the back of my neck. And I felt the space between us hum, electric and wrong and right all at once. Eventually, he turned away, fiddling with the lighters in the junk drawer like he was looking for one that worked better. They all worked the same. And I tried not to watch the way his shoulders moved under the thin old sweatshirt he always wore on nights like this. The crutch slipped a little when I turned back toward the living room, and before I could catch myself, He was there, hand steady at my waist. Not tight, not pushing. Just enough contact to keep me upright. Just enough to make my chest ache for reasons that had nothing to do with balance. We moved back toward the couch like nothing had happened, like we hadn't both frozen for a second too long. And he settled back into the chair with a kind of stiffness that wasn't there before. And I pulled the blanket higher around my shoulders and focused on the candle flame like it could erase the image of his hand lingering at my waist. After a while, could have been minutes, could have been hours, the words slipped out of me before I could catch them, soft and scared and stupid, asking if he remembered that storm years ago, the one where I couldn't sleep, the one where he came into my room without a sound. He didn't look at me when he answered, just stared at the puddle of light from the candle and said, yeah, he remembered. Said he thought maybe it would help. Said sometimes just being there mattered more than saying anything. And maybe it did. Maybe it does. But something in his voice cracked around the edges, and I hated how much I heard it. I wanted to say something back. Wanted to tell him it was fine, that it was nothing, but my throat wouldn't open, and the weight in my chest got heavier, pressing down like a hand that didn't know whether it wanted to comfort or crush. The candle guttered again, and for a second everything felt too sharp, too bright, too close, like the world had folded itself into the narrow space between the two of us and dared us to move. He stood up first, muttering something about checking the upstairs windows, and disappeared down the hall with the flashlight bobbing low to the ground. And I sat there, clutching the half-empty glass like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the ground. When the sound of his footsteps faded, I forced myself up, moving slow, one crutch jammed awkwardly under my arm, the other hand gripping the wall for balance, and made my way toward the stairs, even though every bone in my body screamed to stay put, to pretend none of this was happening. The climb was slow, clumsy, painful, and when I finally reached the top, I just stood there for a second, breathing hard in the darkness, the whole upstairs stretched out in front of me like a mouth about to close. He came out of the guest room then, flashlight low, and our eyes caught across the narrow hallway, and for one stupid, breathless second, neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything, and the whole house held its breath with us. He stepped toward me, slow, measured, hand hovering near my arm like he was offering help but not forcing it. And when I nodded, he guided me the last few steps to my room without a word. Just steady pressure and the unbearable warmth of his body too close to mine. Inside the room, he helped me sit on the edge of the bed, helped swing my leg up onto the mattress with a tenderness that broke something small and sharp inside me, and pulled the blanket up around my shoulders like he was tucking in a child too small to do it themselves. His hand lingered for a second too long at my shoulder, warm through the fabric of my shirt, steady in a way that made my throat close up with something that tasted almost like grief, almost like hunger. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything at all. I just looked up at him, wide-eyed and silent, and he looked back, eyes dark in the candlelight, mouth tight like he was holding back every word neither of us was brave enough to speak. He didn't step away. I didn't either. The candle flickered once, twice, and went out. The morning after the storm didn't feel like a new day at all, not when the air still clung too heavily to the walls, not when the windows sweated under a gray sky, not when the house itself seemed to hold its breath between every creak of the floorboards. The electricity was back, lights blinking, fridge humming like nothing had ever happened. But somehow the air hadn't cleared. Somehow the heaviness from the night before had sunk into the bones of the house and settled there like dust you couldn't wipe away. I stayed upstairs longer than necessary, dragging out the small tasks of getting dressed, brushing my hair, pretending my leg didn't throb every time I moved, because going downstairs felt a lot like stepping back into something I wasn't ready to name, something I wasn't even sure I could pretend away. When I finally hobbled into the kitchen, I found him standing by the sink, wiping down a coffee mug that didn't look dirty, movements slow and mechanical like he needed something to do with his hands. And when he glanced up, the look we exchanged was too quick, too careful, like touching a bruise you don't want to admit is there. Mom was still at work. Her night shifts always stretched into the gray hours of morning. And that left the two of us suspended again in this strange, heavy quiet. Every clink of a dish or shuffle of a chair sounding twice as loud against the thick silence. I moved to the table, pretending not to notice how he shifted slightly away when I passed too close, pretending not to notice how my own body stiffened with the effort it took to stay casual, to keep breathing evenly. The idea of asking him for help getting to the shower had been growing in the back of my mind all morning, thorny and uncomfortable, because I knew there wasn't any other option. Not with my leg like this. And yet the words stuck like burrs in my throat, sharp and impossible to spit out. It took longer than it should have, but finally, after finishing half a glass of water I didn't want, after pretending to look at the weather on my phone even though the screen was just a blur, I cleared my throat and asked, trying to sound casual, trying to sound like it wasn't the worst idea I'd ever had. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, expression unreadable, then set the mug down too carefully on the counter, wiped his hands on the front of his jeans like he was trying to erase something, and said sure in a voice that sounded rougher than the one he'd used all morning. The walk upstairs was slow, awkward, every step measured like we were trying not to trip over invisible lines that hadn't been there yesterday. And when we reached the bathroom door, I hesitated, hand resting on the frame longer than necessary, pulse rabbiting under my skin. He opened the door without comment, stepped aside to let me in first, and when I crossed the threshold, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. Hair tangled, face too pale, eyes too wide, and felt a bolt of something twist low in my stomach. The room filled quickly with steam as he turned the water on, setting the temperature the way he always used to when I was little and hated cold showers, without asking, without needing to ask. And somehow that small gesture made my throat tighten harder than anything else had so far. I struggled with my sweatshirt, fingers clumsy, the fabric catching on my elbow. And when I lost my balance slightly, staggering forward, he caught me automatically, one hand firm at my waist, the other catching my arm just below the shoulder. For a heartbeat, we froze like that, close enough that I could feel the heat from his skin through my t-shirt. Could smell the faint, clean scent of soap clinging to his collar, and even though he dropped his hands quickly, stepped back as if burned, the imprint of him stayed, pulsing against my ribs like an echo. I stepped into the shower stall without looking back, dragging the curtain closed between us, and he turned away, bracing one hand against the doorframe, breathing so steadily and deliberately that it sounded almost like a command to himself. Water pounded against my back, hot enough to sting, but it barely registered over the pounding in my chest, over the awareness of the space he occupied just a few feet away, separated only by a thin sheet of plastic and whatever control either of us still managed to cling to. When I realized I'd forgotten to bring the towel within reach, I cursed under my breath. Quietly, but not quietly enough, and called out for him to hand me one, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to pretend this was still normal. He fumbled for a second, hands clumsy where they usually weren't, and when he finally pushed the towel through the gap in the curtain, I reached for it. Missed. My hand brushing against his wrist, then sliding along the side of his neck before I could yank it back. The contact jolted through both of us like a live wire. I froze, my fingertips burning where they'd touched the tender skin just beneath his jaw. And when he looked up, our faces were only inches apart, steam curling around us like a noose pulling tighter. Neither of us moved first. Or maybe we both did at the same time. I honestly don't know. But suddenly his mouth was on mine, rough and desperate and real, and it wasn't sweet, wasn't careful. It was all heat and tension and the terrible, beautiful release of something we'd both been pretending didn't exist. The kiss broke almost as fast as it started, and we stumbled back like we'd been shoved apart, gasping into the thick air, both of us wide-eyed and stricken like people who had seen something they weren't meant to survive. I gripped the towel tighter against my chest, shaking so hard my knees nearly gave out, and whispered, "This is a mistake." Even though the words tasted hollow, even though part of me wasn't sure if I meant it or if I just knew I was supposed to say it. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, really looked at me, with a kind of rawness that made my stomach twist, then turned on his heel and walked out, letting the door swing shut between us with a soft finality that hit harder than any slam door ever could have. I stood there for a long time after he left, water cooling on my skin, towel clutched like armor, staring at the place where he had been, at the ghost of something we couldn't take back hanging heavy in the air. Maybe, God, was it possible? It had started long before last night, long before this morning, growing slow and silent like mold in the walls, something neither of us wanted to see until it was too late. And now that it had cracked open between us, I knew one thing for sure. Things could never go back to the way they were before. I went to the bathroom just before midnight, moving slowly, one crutch under my arm, the other hand trailing along the hallway wall. Not because I truly needed the support, but because touching something solid helped me stay grounded in a house that was starting to feel less and less like one. The mirror above the sink was still fogged at the edges from earlier, its surface dull and blurred, as if even it didn't want to reflect what had been unfolding between us these past few days. And I couldn't hold my gaze there for more than a few seconds, because the expression in my own eyes felt like a question I had no right to answer. When I stepped back into the living room, the overhead lights had already been turned off, leaving only the soft amber glow of the corner lamp stretching lazy, uneven shadows across the rug, making the room feel deeper and quieter than it ever had before. He stood up when he saw me, not abruptly, not in a way that suggested surprise or guilt, but with the same quiet steadiness I'd come to associate with him over the years. And without hesitation, he asked if I needed help settling in for the night. I told him I didn't, though in truth everything inside me felt unsettled. He waited until I'd positioned the pillow beneath my leg just right, until I'd pulled the blanket over myself in one slow motion that felt more like a ritual than a practical act of comfort. And once I exhaled, as if I'd completed something meaningful, he reached for the remote, turned the volume of the television down to a soft murmur, and sat back into his usual chair, his posture as neutral as ever. We didn't watch the screen. We didn't speak. And yet the silence between us didn't feel empty or peaceful. It felt like a current humming under the floorboards, like static building in the corners of the room, and I could sense his eyes drifting toward me in careful, fleeting glances that he probably thought I wouldn't notice. But I did notice them, just like I noticed the way his breathing subtly shifted when I shifted mine, or how he always sat with his hands resting on his knees now, like he was reminding himself to stay still. Each time our eyes almost met, I instinctively found something else to focus on. A corner of the table, the soft fringe of the rug, a crease in the blanket. Anything to avoid the unbearable tension I knew would follow if I let the contact hold for even a second too long. Still, every time his voice broke the silence, even for something mundane like, "Would you like some tea?" Or, "How's your leg feeling now?" I felt something pull tight inside my chest, like my entire body was being asked a question I couldn't answer with words. At one point, he crossed behind me to fix the curtain that had slipped off its hook during the day, and as he passed, his hand brushed lightly against my shoulder. Not firmly, not deliberately, but just enough to register as warmth. And I felt a tremor rise from the base of my spine so sharply that I flinched without meaning to. He paused for half a second, probably long enough to notice my reaction, but he didn't say anything, didn't stop, didn't comment. Just kept walking across the room and adjusted the curtain as though nothing unusual had happened. Then, as if the house itself had decided I hadn't had enough, my phone lit up again beside me on the armrest. The message was from Mom. It only said 4 words, simple and familiar. "Love you. Still here." I stared at the screen for longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know what to say back, but because those words suddenly felt like they belonged to another version of the night, one that hadn't quite caught up with this one. I typed a response slowly, my fingers trembling ever so slightly, telling her to be safe, to try and rest if she could, to check in again later when she had a moment. Then I flipped the phone face down so its glow wouldn't distract me, though distraction was no longer the problem. Because across from me, in that same old armchair, sat a man who hadn't said more than a dozen words all evening. And yet his presence filled the room louder than any sound the television could have made. And it hit me with terrifying clarity, as I shifted slightly beneath the blanket and felt, without looking, the weight of his gaze land on me again. That I was waiting, not waiting for Mom to text back, not waiting for the news report to end, not waiting for the pain in my leg to fade or for sleep to finally pull me under. I was waiting for the last light in the room to go out. And the moment that happened, I knew. I would no longer be able to lie to myself about what was already unfolding. The storm came back angry, louder than the night before, slamming against the house with a force that made the window frames tremble and the old pipes rattle somewhere deep in the walls. And even though I was asleep when it started, the combination of thunder cracking directly above the roof and the stabbing pain in my leg snapped me awake so fast that for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The room was pitch dark, no glow from the outlets, no blinking lights from the router. Nothing but the heaving sound of the storm pressing against the house like it wanted in. And I reached out blindly for my phone, found it useless and dead in my hand, then lay there for a second too long. Heart hammering, breath shallow, pain radiating up from my knee until it felt like the whole bed was vibrating beneath me. Without even thinking it through, without planning the sound of my own voice, I called out for him. Not loud, almost a whisper, but in a house gone deaf with rain and wind, even a whisper seemed to stretch too far. And I waited, hoping the noise hadn't swallowed my voice whole. A long moment passed, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for fear to twist tighter in my chest, before I saw a thin, unsteady beam of light wobbling across the hallway, and then the soft, slow creak of my door easing open. And there he was, barefoot, hair mussed, sweatshirt slung over his shoulders, flashlight trembling faintly in his hand like the storm had found its way inside him too. He crossed the room without speaking, his steps careful and deliberate, the mattress dipping gently under his weight as he sat down at the edge of the bed, close enough for me to see the way his other hand hovered, uncertain, before finally finding my pillow and adjusting it beneath my leg with a tenderness that made my throat tighten painfully. I told him it hurt worse tonight. Not just the leg, but everything. The dark, the wind, the way the house felt like it was shrinking around me with every crash of thunder. And when he moved closer, when he offered the kind of quiet reassurance that didn't need words, I let my head fall against his shoulder without asking if it was okay, without thinking about anything except the fact that for the first time that night, the room didn't feel quite so unbearable. His hand lifted slowly to my hair, fingers brushing it back behind my ear in a gesture so careful it almost didn't feel real. And for a long time we sat like that, breathing together. The only sounds the distant roar of the storm and the soft, shuddering breath I couldn't quite control. He stayed still for so long that I thought maybe it would be enough. Maybe just this one small mercy could exist without leading somewhere dangerous. But then he spoke, voice so low it barely brushed the space between us, saying he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep pretending. Couldn't keep sitting across the table or walking past me in the hallway without feeling like he was going to lose his mind. He said he didn't know how to stop wanting me. He said he wasn't strong enough to ignore it anymore. And I should have pulled away. I should have said something to cut the moment off at the knees before it could grow legs. But instead, I turned toward him, my cheek sliding against the fabric of his sweatshirt. And when my hand found the side of his face, when my fingers brushed along the edge of his jawline, the decision had already been made somewhere deep and silent inside me. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. He closed the space between us in a single breath. And the way he kissed me wasn't desperate, wasn't frantic. It was slow and heavy and inevitable. The kind of kiss that feels less like an invitation and more like an admission. The kind that leaves no room for questions because every answer has already been written on your skin. The house around us groaned under the weight of the wind, the walls vibrating softly like they could barely hold themselves upright. And in that small space between heartbeats and thunderclaps, we let go of every reason, every defense, every promise we had ever made to anyone else. Everything that followed unfolded with a kind of fragile intensity, movements slow and muted, like the storm outside had drowned out the normal rules of the world and left only this, only touch and breath, and the heat of a choice made too late to take back. Nothing about it was rushed or thoughtless, and maybe that was what made it worse. The knowledge that we were both entirely, painfully aware of what we were doing and still did not stop. The air itself seemed to hum against our skin, charged with something heavier than electricity. And somewhere deep inside the house, I could have sworn I heard the floorboards creak in warning, like even the foundation knew it couldn't survive another hit like this. And then, cutting through the thick, heated silence, came the sharp clatter of keys hitting the front door. Everything froze. The tension in the room snapped tight enough to burn. I pushed up on my elbows, breath catching painfully in my chest, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give us away. And he sat rigid beside me, muscles locked, eyes wide with the kind of terror that has no exit. We could only listen as the door creaked open, the hinges groaning under the weight of what they were about to deliver, and her voice floated in, casual, tired, calling my name in that absent-minded way people do when they are already halfway toward setting down their keys and kicking off their shoes. He scrambled off the bed first, moving with a quiet desperation that made my stomach twist painfully, adjusting the blanket up over me as though covering the evidence could somehow undo it. And he was halfway across the room when the door to my bedroom swung inward with a slow, deliberate push. My mother stood framed in the doorway, hair damp from the mist, jacket still slipping off her shoulders, her hand frozen on the knob, eyes locking immediately onto the scene in front of her. Me, lying flushed and stunned in a tangled bed. Him standing too still, too guilty. The air itself thick and broken between us. The look in her eyes was enough to crack open every silent confession, every hidden word, every denial I had been preparing without even knowing it. And then, with a composure I could never have predicted, she stepped back, pulled the door closed with a soft, echoing click, and walked away down the hall, the sound of her footsteps disappearing one careful, crushing step at a time. The silence that followed was worse than any storm, worse than any crash of thunder or snap of lightning, because it was the silence of something vital breaking cleanly in two, something that would never, ever, be put back together the same way again. The morning after did not scream with drama or collapse beneath the weight of a single terrible realization. It simply unfolded slowly, like an old bruise spreading under thin skin, leaving everything looking almost exactly the same as before, yet somehow stripped of every quiet comfort that had once made this house feel like home. And when I opened my eyes, the air around me felt too still, too cautious, as if it already knew that something essential had been broken while the walls politely pretended not to notice. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and in its place there was only a soft mist curling at the windows, filtering the morning light into something muted and pale. Something that touched every surface of the house with an uncomfortable gentleness that made my skin itch under the covers. And as I lay there, perfectly still beneath the blanket, I realized that I was afraid to move, afraid that even shifting slightly might disturb whatever fragile agreement was holding this silence together. Downstairs, I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the clink of a mug against the countertop sharp enough to make me flinch even from 2 floors away. And there was something about the way she moved, the unhurried carefulness of it, that made me almost certain she had not slept at all, that she had spent the night pacing or staring at a ceiling just like I had, breathing the same heavy air filled with everything we now knew and could not say. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, telling myself it was because of the ache in my leg, because of the difficulty of navigating the stairs. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it, that the real reason was rooted somewhere much uglier, somewhere in the part of me that still couldn't decide whether it was safer to hide or to face the wreckage I had helped create. When I finally made my way down, crutches awkward under my arms, each step measured and slow, I found her exactly where I expected, standing by the stove, back turned, shoulders drawn up tight beneath her robe, her hair pulled into a rough knot that looked like it had been done with trembling hands. And when she heard me enter, she didn't turn around, didn't greet me with the soft, tired smile she usually saved for mornings after her night shifts, but instead just murmured a neutral, "Good morning," into the empty space between us. I answered back, voice thin and small in my own ears, and moved to the chair furthest from hers, lowering myself into it with more care than I probably needed, hyper-aware of how loudly the crutches clattered against the table leg as I tried to arrange them out of the way. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, but the rich, grounding scent that usually made this room feel like the heart of the house now seemed thin and artificial, as if someone had sprayed a memory of coffee into the air and hoped it would be enough to fool us both. And I wrapped my hands around the mug she had set down for me without comment, feeling the steam prickle against my skin without offering any real warmth. She didn't ask how I slept. I didn't ask her how her shift had gone. We just sat there, two people who had spent the night on opposite sides of a shattering, pretending not to notice the broken edges scattered across the table between us. I could feel the words sitting heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs with every breath. But every time I thought about speaking, about apologizing, about trying to explain the unexplainable, my throat closed tighter. as if even my body refused to let me lie by pretending there was anything left to salvage. After a while, she said she needed to go out for a few hours, errands to run, paperwork to handle at the clinic, appointments she couldn't reschedule. And even though the list sounded rehearsed, like it was designed more for her own benefit than for mine, I nodded without argument, grateful for the space, even if the gratitude tasted like rust at the back of my tongue. When she left, the house didn't sigh or relax the way it sometimes did after a long night. It simply held its breath a little longer, tightening around me like a fist. I moved through the rooms in slow circles, picking up objects I didn't need, smoothing already flat blankets, wiping spotless counters, all the while feeling like an intruder in a life I had no right to inhabit anymore. And every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded less like a home settling and more like a warning, like the house itself wanted me gone. When I passed by the front window, I caught my reflection in the glass. Pale, drawn, eyes too wide and dark. And for one strange, disorienting second, I didn't recognize myself. Didn't see the girl who used to laugh at bad sitcoms with her mother on this very couch. Didn't see the careful daughter who used to organize surprise birthday dinners and leave sticky notes of encouragement on the fridge. But only someone hollowed out. Someone stitched together from choices she didn't even want to name aloud. I tried to make tea, thinking maybe the ritual of it would anchor me, would make the kitchen feel less like a stage after the audience had left. But even the smell of mint rising from the mug felt thin and insufficient, and I abandoned it after one sip, walking instead to the back door where the mist had thickened into something heavier, something that pressed against the glass with soft, steady persistence. I opened the door slightly, just enough to let the air inside, and immediately regretted it, because the air was too clean, too sharp, carrying none of the weight of last night, none of the ache. And I stood there for a long time, letting it sting my skin, wondering if it was possible to suffocate in air that was too pure to forgive me. He didn't come back. Not that morning, not that afternoon. And the longer the house stayed empty of his footsteps, the heavier the silence became, filling up every corner, every closet, every forgotten drawer, until it felt like the house itself was crumbling from the inside out, its foundation too cracked to stand another storm. I sat on the couch by the cold fireplace, the same place where we had laughed during power outages and shared quiet Sunday mornings. And for the first time, I noticed how small the room really was, how little space there was to hide from the memory of what we had done, how every shadow looked just a little too much like the outline of something you couldn't unsee once you knew where to look. I thought about calling him, about sending some small message that might make sense of the mess between us, but my hand refused to reach for my phone, and in the end, I just sat there, staring at the blank television screen, watching my own hollow reflection stare back. Later, as the light faded and the mist thickened into a cold, wet evening, I wandered upstairs again, pausing in front of the hallway mirror, the one where my mother once adjusted my coat before school, telling me to hold my head high, to be proud, to trust the person I was becoming. But I couldn't lift my chin today, couldn't meet my own eyes without flinching, because somewhere deep inside, where no excuse could reach, I knew I had crossed a line that love alone could never uncross. And now the only thing left was to stand here in the too clean air of a house that remembered everything, pretending not to notice that the girl my mother had raised had slipped quietly out of sight, leaving someone else behind to bear the silence. And somehow, that silence was louder than any storm.